My name is Grace, and at my in-laws' vow renewal, my mother-in-law walked into the garden wearing my wedding dress. Not a similar dress. Mine, the one made from my late mother's gown, sealed in a box in our guest room closet for the last 3 years. My husband looked at me and whispered, "Please don't make a scene." I was 42 when this happened, and for a long time I believed the worst part was the dress itself being ruined. I was wrong. The worst part was discovering how many people had quietly agreed that my pain was an acceptable price for keeping their own lives comfortable. Before I tell you how the truth finally came out, subscribe to Unheard drama stories. Here, the people who were ignored get to finish their own sentences, and the truth is allowed to arrive without shouting. The dress my mother left. My mother died when I was 26, 3 years before I married Aaron. She had kept her own wedding gown wrapped in cedar paper for decades, even though the style belonged to another era entirely. Before she got sick, she told me I could cut it, dye it, or use just one small piece of it. "A dress should serve a life," she said, holding my hands the way she always did when she wanted me to actually listen, not become a museum. A seamstress used the lace from my mother's sleeves and the row of fabric-covered buttons down her back to build my gown. It was simple, soft, deeply personal in a way no store-bought dress could ever be. After the wedding, I had it professionally cleaned and boxed, and Aaron knew, because I told him plainly, more than once, that this dress was the only object I owned that still carried the shape of my mother's hands. His mother, Helena, had always treated sentimental things as community property. She borrowed jewelry without asking and simply wore it to dinner. She rearranged our furniture during visits like our house was an extension of hers. She once gave an entire set of my serving dishes to Aaron's cousin because, in her words, I had plenty. Aaron always called it enthusiasm. I called it a boundary problem. But I rarely pushed, because every time I objected, it somehow became proof that I disliked his family, never proof that she'd done something wrong. Looking back now, I understand something I resisted for a long time. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Sometimes peace only begins the moment you finally let the necessary conflict happen out loud, in the open, instead of swallowing it to keep everyone else comfortable. Stay with me, because what happened in that garden is only the beginning. The real betrayal was buried 6 weeks earlier, and it took me a long time to find it. The missing box. 2 weeks before Helena and Robert's 40th anniversary vow renewal, I went to the guest room closet to grab a shawl, and the dress box was simply gone. When I asked Aaron, he said he'd moved some things to the basement during a plumbing repair. I checked the basement myself. Nothing. He got irritated when I kept asking about it, told me the box was probably behind the holiday decoration somewhere, that he'd look later. Something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, like he'd already practiced the sentence in his head before I even asked the question. So I called the preservation company myself. What they told me stopped me cold. Someone had opened the box 6 weeks earlier and returned the gown to them for alterations. The request had come from Helena's phone number. The employee on the call assumed I had personally authorized it because whoever called knew my name, my wedding date, and the exact storage invoice number. When I confronted Aaron with that, he finally admitted his mother had asked to borrow the lace for her own ceremony. He claimed, and I want to be fair, I think some part of him actually believed this, that he thought she meant adding one small piece to a new dress of her own. He'd handed her the box because he didn't want another argument with her. Not because he thought it was right, because it was easier. Then he asked me to just wait until after the celebration to talk about it properly. I want to be honest about something. I did not want revenge. Revenge would have kept me emotionally chained to both of them for years. What I actually wanted was a clean record of the truth, a boundary that could never again be quietly renegotiated behind my back, and a future that didn't depend on either of them suddenly growing a conscience they'd never shown before. Once those facts were sitting in front of me, all the old family explanations stopped sounding harmless. I began to understand that this wasn't really about one dress, one event, one bad decision. It was about a long-standing arrangement where other people made the choices, and I was simply expected to absorb whatever consequences landed on me afterward. There was real, practical damage in what had happened, but underneath it was a quieter, colder loss. the realization that someone had planned this entire thing around my expected silence. For the first time in longer than I care to admit, I gave my own memory the same credibility I had always automatically given everyone else's version of events. The garden entrance. I went to the ceremony anyway, still holding onto some small hope that Helena had only taken a ribbon, a button, something minor. Then the music started, and she walked through the garden wearing the entire gown. The waist had been taken in to fit her. The neckline had been lowered. My mother's lace sleeves, the ones I had specifically asked to keep untouched, had been cut down into short cap sleeves, and every one of the fabric-covered buttons had been ripped off and replaced with rhinestones. The guests applauded. Helena lifted the skirt slightly, smiling for the crowd, and announced that she was wearing the family wedding dress, like it had always belonged to everyone but me. Aaron's hand closed around my arm before I could even react. "Please," he whispered, "don't make a scene. We'll deal with it later." And in that exact moment, I understood something about my marriage that I hadn't fully let myself see before. That later was simply the place where my feelings got stored away until everyone else had finished enjoying themselves. I didn't scream. I didn't interrupt a single vow. I just stepped away from him, quietly walked to the parking area, and called a friend to come get me. Before I left, though, I took one clear photograph of the dress and one of the printed ceremony program, which described it, in writing, as Helena's redesigned heirloom. Quiet did not mean consent. People tend to imagine courage as something loud. Mine was quiet that night. It looked like saving screenshots in a folder on my phone, making copies of receipts, calling a professional instead of calling my husband back, refusing to answer message after message clearly designed to pull me back into panic before I'd had a chance to think clearly. I was still afraid, the whole time. I just stopped letting that fear be the thing that made my decisions for me. In the days after that discovery, I started noticing details I had spent years dismissing without even realizing it. How often concern in that family was really just pressure wearing a nicer outfit, forgive quickly, decide privately, don't embarrass anyone, and never forget everything they've supposedly done for you in the past. The more calmly I responded to all of it, the more urgently everyone around me tried to provoke some emotional reaction out of me instead. I understood exactly why. Anger would have let them change the subject from what actually happened to how I behaved after finding out, so I refused to give them that subject change. The online shop. At my friend's house that night, unable to sleep, I opened Helena's social media pages looking for any photo of the alteration process, proof, evidence, anything. Instead, I found something I never expected, a link to an online resale account under a nickname I didn't recognize at first, but the items in the listings I recognized instantly. My mother's silver compact, a bracelet that had belonged to Aaron's grandmother, crystal glasses we'd received at our engagement party. A vintage watch Aaron genuinely believed was sitting at a repair shop right now. Helena, it turned out, had been quietly taking items from relatives for years, selling some, repurposing others, waving away every question with the same tired excuse, forgetfulness, misplaced things, old age. The dress wasn't some isolated, one-time impulse. It was simply the moment she finally felt confident enough to display the theft publicly, out loud, in front of 40 witnesses. Aaron called me over and over that night. Every message focused on one thing: how my leaving had embarrassed his parents in front of their guests. He kept insisting his mother had misunderstood the significance, that the dress had looked beautiful on her, as if that was ever the actual point. I sent him exactly one reply: the preservation receipt, screenshots of the resale listings, and a single sentence. "I will speak with you after you decide whether the problem is what your mother did, or that I refused to smile while she did it." Then I turned my phone off completely. The hardest part, honestly, wasn't the anger. It was accepting that even a sincere apology, and I wasn't sure I'd even get one, would never hand back the version of this marriage I thought I'd been living inside for the last 12 years. Some truths don't just solve a mystery. They quietly rewrite the meaning of every year that came before them. I had to accept something else too, something harder to swallow. The people who had benefited from my old silence for years were probably never going to call my new boundary fair. Their agreement was never actually a requirement for my own protection. I didn't feel brave, exactly, in that moment. I felt prepared. and it turned out preparation was enough to keep moving forward on its own. If you've ever been told to stay calm while watching someone dismantle the one thing that still connected you to a person you lost, keep listening. Because what I found the next morning changed everything about how this story ends. The shop owner. The next morning, I contacted the consignment shop directly. The owner was genuinely horrified once she understood what she was looking at. Helena had told her she was clearing out her own late mother's estate and had even provided signed forms to back that story up. Some items were already gone, resold to strangers who had no idea what they were actually holding. But the watch and the silver compact were still sitting in inventory. The owner placed an immediate hold on both and handed me exactly the documentation I needed to prove real ownership. That same afternoon, Aaron finally showed up at my friend's house, alone, without his mother for once. He looked genuinely exhausted, like he hadn't slept either. He admitted, quietly, that Helena had asked him directly for the storage invoice number so she could convince the preservation company she had authority to request the gown. And he had given it to her, not because he thought it was right. Because he already knew, deep down, that I would say no, and avoiding his mother's disappointment had felt easier, in the moment, than honoring my answer. That was the betrayal I couldn't reduce down to a dress. A dress can be a tragedy. This was a decision. I told him plainly that I would not come home until the locks were changed. Every spare key Helena had ever been given was collected, and he started individual counseling, real counseling, not a single defensive conversation, and then silence. I also wanted a full written inventory of every family item Helena had ever had access to, going back years. He said my conditions sounded extreme. I told him so had watching his mother wear my grief in public, while he stood beside me asking me to protect everyone's party instead. Helena's explanation. Helena eventually requested a family meeting. She arrived carrying the dress in a garment bag, behaving as though the simple act of returning it resolved absolutely everything that had happened. She said she'd only wanted to honor my mother, to start a new family tradition. When I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why honoring someone required cutting apart the only garment they'd left behind for me specifically, she told me fabric was meant to be used. I reminded her, slowly and clearly, that my mother had given that permission to me, not to her. Then I placed the photographs of the resale listings on the table between us, one at a time. Robert immediately recognized his own late mother's brooch. Aaron's sister recognized a baby bracelet she'd spent months searching for after a move, one she'd assumed she'd simply lost. Helena's confidence, for the first time in the entire conversation, completely disappeared. She said, eventually, that she sold things because the rest of the family didn't appreciate them, and that she'd used the money for experiences everyone enjoyed. Bank records that came out later told a very different story. Most of it had gone toward personal credit card debt and cosmetic treatments no one else in the family had ever seen or benefited from. Robert asked her, quietly, exactly how many objects she had taken over the years. Helena started crying and said she felt attacked. For once in that family's history, nobody rushed in to rescue her from the question. For years, I had defaulted to explaining every one of Helena's actions in the kindest possible light, an old habit of mine, softening hard truths until everyone else in the room felt comfortable again, even in moments when I was clearly the one actually being hurt. Looking back at it now, that instinct was never really kindness. It was fear, dressed up carefully to look like patience. Repair without restoration. The seamstress who had altered the gown genuinely believed Helena was its rightful owner the whole time. Once she understood the truth, she offered to restore what she could, but the original sleeves had already been cut too severely to ever go back to what they were. She salvaged the lace caps that remained, carefully removed every rhinestone, and set the surviving buttons into a small fabric-lined frame instead. I made a decision at that point that surprised even me. I chose not to recreate the exact original wedding dress. Restoration, I realized, can quietly become just another way of pretending the damage never happened at all. Instead, the seamstress used the undamaged part of the skirt to create a simple christening-style keepsake gown, even though Aaron and I don't have children of our own. I donated it to a local organization that provides remembrance garments to families after pregnancy, and infant loss. My mother always said a dress should serve a life. I decided it could serve someone else's grief too, not just mine. The framed buttons hang in my bedroom now. They're smaller than the gown ever was, but they belong to me completely in a way nothing borrowed or half-shared ever really can. What made this whole situation so hard for other people to understand afterward was that none of it looked dramatic from the outside. No broken dishes. No shouting in the street. No scene dramatic enough to make a stranger stop and stare. The real damage happened quietly, in polite sentences, in delayed replies, in information conveniently left out, in decisions that had already been finalized long before I was ever invited into the room to discuss them. My marriage after the ceremony. Aaron and I separated for 4 months. He went to counseling on his own and slowly started actually examining how often he had used me as a shield standing between himself and his mother, rather than standing beside me against her. He changed the locks himself. He recovered several of the missing items. He supported both his father and his sister in filing police reports for everything Helena had sold without permission. I didn't come back because he apologized once. Plenty of people apologize once. I came back only after his actual behavior stayed different the next time Helena cried and blamed and threatened to cut him off entirely if he didn't take her side. That time, he didn't ask me to absorb the consequences of her emotions for her. He just let her be upset and stayed exactly where he was. We later held our own small, private vow renewal in the little chapel where my own parents had married decades earlier. I wore a plain navy dress. No heirloom fabric. No family audience. No photographs posted anywhere online for anyone else to comment on. In his vows, Aaron said one sentence I had genuinely never heard from him before in 12 years of marriage. "Your no will not become my mother's maybe." That sentence, honestly, mattered more to me than any traditional promise about forever ever could. I wish I could say I'd recognized this entire pattern years earlier. I didn't. When you've loved people for a long time, your own mind does strange, generous work on their behalf without you ever asking it to. It goes looking for the innocent explanation first. It quietly edits out the sharpest edges. It calls betrayal a misunderstanding, because a misunderstanding still feels like something that can eventually be repaired. What happened after? Helena entered treatment for compulsive spending and agreed to a formal repayment plan with the rest of the family. Robert is still married to her, but they separated their finances completely. Aaron's sister and I have actually grown closer since all of this, mostly because we finally stopped treating Helena's behavior as a random collection of unrelated little accidents and started calling it what it always was. I keep very limited contact with Helena now. She isn't allowed in our home unless one of us is physically present, and she doesn't borrow anything from anyone anymore, not jewelry, not dishes, not stories about who supposedly gave permission for what. She calls those rules humiliating. I call them the natural shape trust takes after it's been broken this badly. That garden photograph still exists somewhere online, tucked into other people's wedding albums from that day. I don't panic anymore when I happen to see it. The woman standing in my mother's dress was never actually the keeper of what that dress meant. I always was. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a family is simply refuse to keep participating in its favorite lie. The lesson I kept. The worst loss, in the end, was never really the fabric. It was learning that my own husband had accurately predicted exactly how much this would hurt me, and chosen his mother's comfort anyway, in that exact moment, without hesitating. Objects can sometimes be repaired, more or less, with enough time and the right hands. Trust gets repaired differently, through small, repeated choices, made specifically in moments when the person who caused the harm is not at all pleased with the boundary you've drawn. Some people in your life will call your boundary cruel, simply because your silence used to be so convenient for them. Let them say it. A peaceful life built honestly on the truth might look smaller from the outside than the life you gave up to get there. But it feels infinitely larger once you're finally standing inside it free, with nothing left to hide. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been made to feel selfish simply for protecting yourself, I want you to remember this clearly. Love does not require you to disappear. Subscribe to Unheard Drama Stories for more stories where hidden truths finally get to have a voice.